The air in the observatory tasted of old dust and ozone, a familiar comfort. Outside, the wind howled, a mournful symphony that had been the constant soundtrack to my life since the snows came. This mountain town, cut off by winter, traditions preserved, clung to its isolation like a stubborn lichen. And I, Thomas, clung to my instruments, to the cold, hard data that refused to lie. My wife, Elena, had loved the quiet here. She'd said it was a place where the world's noise faded, leaving only the essential. Now, the quiet was a vast, echoing chamber, and I was the only one left to fill it. The silence pressed in, heavy as the snowdrifts outside, a constant reminder of her absence. I traced the rim of my coffee mug, the ceramic cool against my fingertips. Years had passed, but the ache remained, a dull throb beneath the surface of my days. I'd come here seeking refuge, a place to disappear into the endless expanse of the cosmos. My work, once a source of exhilaration, had become a penance, a way to outrun the memories that clung to me like frost. Tonight, however, was different. My fingers danced across the keyboard, pulling up the latest telemetry, all as expected, all mundane. I sighed, the sound swallowed by the vastness of the dome. Another night of chasing ghosts. Then a flicker, an anomaly, not a glitch, not a rogue signal. This was different. It was a waveform, impossibly complex, appearing where no such complexity should exist. It was faint, almost imperceptible, buried deep within the background noise. My brow furrowed. I zoomed in, isolating the signal. My heart, a traitorous organ, gave a sudden, hard beat against my ribs. It wasn't just complex, it was structured. There was a deliberate cadence to it, a rhythm that spoke of something far beyond random chance. I'd spent my life studying the universe, its grand, impersonal forces, its indifferent beauty. I knew its language, or so I thought. This signal spoke in a tongue I'd never encountered, a language of pure alien mathematics. My breath hitched. I ran the diagnostic checks again, all systems nominal. The data was clean, unfiltered. This was real. My hands, usually steady, began to tremble. I leaned closer to the screen, my eyes scanning the intricate patterns. They shifted, reformed like a kaleidoscope of impassable geometries. It was beautiful in a way that made my skin crawl. The signal seemed to respond to my attention, growing stronger, clearer. It was as if it knew I was watching. This wasn't just data. It felt directed, personal. I pulled up archival data, cross-referencing the coordinates. Nothing. No known celestial object, no predicted event. I felt a growing sense of unease, a primal fear that clawed at the edges of my scientific objectivity. The wind outside seemed to intensify, rattling the sturdy glass of the dome. I started to isolate the signal, to try and decipher its origin. The patterns were unlike anything I had ever seen or even conceived of. They hinted at a scale of existence that dwarfed human understanding, a complexity that hinted at an intelligence so vast, so ancient, it defied comprehension. My mind, trained to seek logical explanations, struggled to grasp what my instruments were revealing. This wasn't the universe as I knew it. This was something else, something older, something. Awake, was it possible? Could something so profound, so alien, have remained hidden for so long? And if it was real, what did it want? The cold bit at my exposed hands as I adjusted the telescope's focus, a futile gesture. The sky was a smear of bruised purple and angry gray, the snow-laden pines clawing at the horizon. This mountain town, cut off by winter, traditions preserved, was supposed to be my sanctuary, a place where the vast, indifferent canvas of space could absorb my grief. Instead, it felt like a cage, the silence amplifying the echoes of my wife's laughter, a sound I'd lost to a fever that no amount of cosmic data could explain. I ran another diagnostic, the hum of the ancient machinery, a low thrum against the wind's shriek. Hours bled into one another, marked only by the shifting light and the growing ache in my joints. The data streams flickered, mundane, predictable. Stellar drift, gravitational anomalies, the usual cosmic ballet, nothing that would stir the dead or mend the fractured pieces of my own existence. Then it happened. A flicker. Not on the main monitor, but on the auxiliary feed, the one I'd rigged to capture residual energy signatures. A ripple. A distortion in the usual static, like a stone dropped into a perfectly still pond. My breath hitched. It was the same signature I'd seen months ago, the one that had sent me scrambling, the one that had been dismissed as sensor malfunction, a glitch in the matrix. The auxiliary feed amplified, the image resolving into a jagged, ephemeral shape against the predictable star field. It wasn't a nebula, not a known celestial body. The energy readings spiked, a chaotic symphony of frequencies that defied categorization. My scientific mind, honed by years of rigorous logic, rebelled. This was impossible, but it was there, undeniable. I leaned closer, my nose almost touching the cool glass of the monitor. The shape shifted, elongating, twisting. It was impossibly vast, stretching across light years, yet it seemed to possess a strange internal coherence. It felt directed, as if it were observing me, the lone figure hunched in this remote observatory, a speck of dust on a frozen world. A shiver, unrelated to the biting wind, traced a path down my spine. The only sound was my own ragged breathing, the frantic thumping of my pulse against my ribs. I remembered the dismissive tone of the observatory director, the gentle, condescending pat on my shoulder. Grief can play tricks, Thomas. The mind seeks patterns where none exist. But this wasn't a pattern. This was a disruption, a cosmic aberration. The anomalous signature intensified, the pulses becoming more rapid, more insistent. The raw data flooded the screen, a flood of information I couldn't begin to process. It was a language I didn't understand, a geometry that bent the rules of perception. It wasn't random. It was a signal, and it was growing stronger. I felt a prickling sensation on my skin, as if I were being watched by countless unseen eyes. The air in the observatory grew heavy, charged with an unseen energy. The dust motes dancing in the beam of my desk lamp seemed to swirl with an unnatural purpose. Else, my hands trembled as I tried to isolate the source of the transmission. It wasn't coming from a single point, but from the anomaly itself, a pervasive emanation. It felt ancient, impossibly old, predating the stars, predating the very concept of time. And it was here, now, focused. It wasn't just a phenomenon, it was an intelligence, and it had noticed me. The jagged shape on the screen began to contort, pulling inwards, coalescing. It was a transformation not of space, but of something else, something fundamental. A pressure began to build behind my eyes, a dull, insistent ache. The wind picked up again, but this time it sounded different. I stared at the screen, mesmerized and terrified. The anomaly was not just a visual distortion. It was a manifestation. Of what? What ancient thing had finally decided to cast its gaze upon this small, insignificant planet? And why, in this moment, did it feel like it was looking directly at me? The hum of the ancient server rack was a low, resonant thrum against the silence. It was a sound I'd grown to find more comforting than any human voice, a steady pulse in the disquieting quiet of this mountain town, cut off by winter, traditions preserved. My fingers, stiff and raw from the cold, danced across the keyboard, the glow of the monitor painting my face in a sickly green light. Outside, the wind howled like a banshee, rattling the old wooden shutters of the small cabin I'd rented, a place chosen for its isolation, its distance from the prying eyes of my former colleagues. I'd been staring at the data for weeks, a tangled knot of spectral signatures and redshift anomalies that defied every known cosmological model. It was like finding a single, perfectly formed obsidian shard in a field of common quartz. My wife, Elena, would have loved this. Her curiosity had always been a wildfire, burning brighter than any star. Now, only the ashes of her memory remained, and this impossible data was all I had left to feed the embers. The anomaly wasn't just a static point. It pulsed, a slow, deliberate beat against the cosmic background radiation. And the signature, it wasn't a chemical composition I recognized. It was a harmonic resonance, a complex interplay of frequencies that seemed to respond. Respond to what? To the universe itself, to the very fabric of spacetime. I ran the simulations again, tweaking parameters, pushing the computational limits of this antiquated hardware. Each iteration brought me closer and further away from understanding. Then it happened. A pattern emerged, not in the spectral lines themselves, but in their arrangement. It was a sequence, a series of intricate, repeating motifs that felt intentional, My breath hitched. This wasn't a natural phenomenon. It was too ordered, too deliberate. It was like finding a sonnet etched into the surface of a supernova. The sequence wasn't random. It was information. I felt a prickling sensation on my skin, as if unseen eyes were now fixed upon me across unimaginable distances. My hands trembled, threatening to smudge the delicate lines on the screen. I pulled up the historical logs, tracing the anomaly's appearance. It wasn't a recent development. It had been there, dormant for eons. But in the last few decades, its activity had subtly increased. A slow, inexorable climb. I cross-referenced it with stellar formation data, with galactic drift patterns, with the faint gravitational echoes of distant black holes. Nothing. It was an outlier, a rogue element in the grand cosmic ballet. But the more I looked, the more I felt a profound, unsettling connection. The data wasn't just out there. It was reaching for something. And the implications of that thought were beginning to curdle in my stomach like spoiled milk. My gaze drifted to the window. The snow had stopped, leaving the pines draped in a pristine, silent white. It was beautiful, breathtakingly so. But now it felt wrong. The silence was too deep, the stillness too profound. It was the quiet before a storm, a held breath that stretched into an eternity. I remembered a passage from an old astronomy text, something about the potential for non-biological intelligences, entities that existed as pure energy, as patterns woven into reality itself. At the time, it had seemed like fanciful speculation, the ramblings of a dreamer. Now, staring at the alien script flickering on my screen, it felt like a prophecy. This anomaly. It wasn't just a data point. It was a message, a greeting, or perhaps a warning. My heart began to beat a little faster, a frantic bird trapped in my chest. The sheer scale of it was overwhelming. An intelligence that could imprint its signature onto the cosmos itself, an entity that had existed for longer than stars, for longer than galaxies. What could it possibly want with a single, insignificant astrophysicist in a remote mountain town cut off by winter, traditions preserved? I leaned back, the worn leather of the chair creaking in protest. The air in the cabin felt suddenly thin, heavy. The hum of the servos seemed to grow louder, more insistent. I ran a hand over my face, the rough stubble a familiar grounding sensation. But it wasn't enough. What if it was reaching for me? My fingers, stiff and raw from the cold, danced across the keyboard, each tap a desperate prayer. The raw data, a chaotic symphony of cosmic noise, was slowly yielding to my persistent probing. They were too structured, too deliberate. This time, I wasn't just looking at nebulae or the predictable decay of distant stars. The initial anomaly, the one that had drawn me here, was a mere ripple compared to what I was uncovering. It was like finding a single, perfect snowflake and then realizing I was standing in the heart of a blizzard. I traced a pattern, a signature, across disparate datasets spanning decades, even centuries if I accounted for the light travel time. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, like a faint scent carried on a wind that had long since died. But it was there. A recurring deviation in the spectral analysis of distant quasars, a peculiar oscillation in the gravitational lensing around black holes, a phantom signal that flickered in and out of existence in the background radiation. Each instance was isolated, dismissed by its original discoverers as equipment malfunction or atmospheric interference. But I saw the thread, my breath hitched. The screen flickered, displaying a complex waveform. It wasn't random. It was a sequence, a mathematical progression that felt familiar. Not familiar in a way I could articulate, but in a deep, primal sense, like a forgotten language resonating in my bones. I cross-referenced it with the initial anomaly, the one that had started this descent. They aligned. This wasn't a new discovery. This was old. Terribly, anciently old. I pushed my chair back, the worn leather groaning. The small room, a converted storage space in the back of the town's historical society, felt impossibly small. Dust motes, illuminated by the weak glow of the monitor, swirled like tiny lost galaxies. The scent of aged paper and something else, something faintly metallic and sterile, hung in the air. My eyes scanned the printouts scattered across the desk. a constellation of numbers and graphs that held a terrifying narrative. There was a series of readings from a deep space probe launched in the late 1970. Its mission, to study the heliosphere. It had been declared lost after a catastrophic system failure, its data stream abruptly cut off. But before that, for a fleeting few hours, it had registered a series of energy fluctuations unlike anything predicted. The data was corrupted, fragmented, but I'd managed to piece together enough. And the pattern, it matched, the same alien cadence. My hands trembled as I brought up another file, this one from a terrestrial radio telescope, an older, more primitive instrument. The year was 1952. The observer, a young, ambitious astronomer, had reported detecting a series of structured radio pulses originating from a region of space previously thought to be empty. His findings were ridiculed, dismissed as an artifact of the burgeoning field of radio astronomy. But the spectral signature, it was there again, a ghost in the machine. I leaned closer to the screen, my face inches from the glowing pixels. This entity, whatever it was, wasn't new to the cosmic stage. It had been here, or at least its influence had, for a very long time. It left traces, like a colossal hand brushing against reality, leaving behind faint fingerprints. And these fingerprints, these recurring patterns, were not random. They were deliberate. They were markers. The implications began to coalesce, each one a shard of ice piercing my thoughts. If this entity had been interacting with the universe for so long, what were its intentions? Was it a benevolent observer, a cosmic gardener tending to nascent civilizations, or something far more predatory? The sheer scale of the data, the breadth of its apparent reach across time and space, was overwhelming. It suggested a power that dwarfed human understanding, a consciousness that had witnessed the birth and death of stars. The quiet of the mountain town suddenly felt less like sanctuary and more like isolation. The snow outside, which had seemed so beautiful and pure, now felt like a shroud, muffling the world, cutting me off from any possibility of help. The hum of the server rack, once a comfort, now sounded like a slow, deep breath, a prelude to something vast and terrible. My gaze fell upon a final file, a recent one, logged just a few years ago. It was from a SETI project, a brief, inexplicable blip of structured signal from a nearby star system. The signal had been too short-lived to analyze, too weak to confirm. But the underlying frequency, the subtle modulation, it was the same. The patterns on the screen were no longer just data. They were echoes of a cosmic conversation, a dialogue I was now privy to. And the latest echo, the one from just a few years ago, felt like a greeting, or perhaps a warning. Why had it chosen to reveal itself, however subtly, to so many different points in space and time? Was it a form of communication, a way of announcing its presence? Or was it something else entirely, a byproduct of its passage, like the wake of a ship? The weight of the discovery pressed down on me, a crushing certainty that the universe was not as empty or as benign as I had once believed. The questions multiplied, each one more terrifying than the last. What was this entity, and what did it want with us? My fingers, stiff and raw from the cold, danced across the keyboard. The blizzard outside had raged for 3 days, burying the narrow roads, isolating us completely. I hadn't slept in what felt like an eternity, fueled by lukewarm coffee and a gnawing, desperate curiosity. The data streams were a chaotic ballet of numbers and symbols, a cosmic language I was slowly, painstakingly learning to decipher. It was in the background radiation, a faint tremor in the fabric of space-time, too structured to be random, too vast to be local. My wife, Alina, had loved stargazing. I missed her. The ache was a constant, dull throb beneath the surface of my thoughts, a reminder of everything I had lost. Then it happened. A pattern emerged, not within the usual deep space observations, but in a set of recent, highly localized energy readings. They were faint, almost imperceptible, a ripple in the cosmic pond that shouldn't have been there. But the temporal signature, it was unmistakable. It was aligning with something else. Something I had dismissed as a statistical outlier, a fleeting hiccup in the grand cosmic machinery. My breath hitched. I zoomed in on the timestamp, cross-referencing it with a different set of data, one I'd flagged weeks ago as an anomaly in itself. A gravitational lensing event, not just any lensing event, but one that was predicted to occur with unprecedented intensity, a cosmic alignment so rare that most of my colleagues had written it off as a theoretical curiosity. The entity, it wasn't just there, it was acting. The readings from the mountain town cut off by winter, traditions preserved, were not just passive observations, they were a response. A precise, calculated interaction with an impending cosmic phenomenon. My hands trembled, scattering a pile of printouts. The server rack's hum seemed to deepen, to take on a more sinister resonance. It felt like a heartbeat, slow and ancient, waiting. I remembered the initial anomaly, the faint signal that had first drawn me in. It wasn't a static presence. It was dynamic. It was growing. And now it was synchronizing with this gravitational event. The energy fluctuations were intensifying, not randomly, but in a controlled, directional surge. It was as if the entity was using the lensing event as a lens itself, focusing its attention, or perhaps its influence, towards a specific point. A point that, according to my calculations, was directly on a trajectory that included our solar system. The entity wasn't merely observing the universe, it was shaping it. The gravitational lensing event, this immense cosmic alignment, was not a natural occurrence in its full scope. It was a stage being set. The data wasn't just data, it was a blueprint, a prelude. The flickering lights seemed to pulse in time with my own erratic heartbeat. I felt a prickling sensation on my skin, a phantom touch that wasn't there. The air in the warehouse grew heavy, thick with an unseen presence. The blizzard was a cage, yes, but it was also a shield. Or was it a trap? I scrolled through the latest telemetry, my eyes scanning the rapidly updating figures. The surge was accelerating. The synchronization was becoming absolute. The entity was preparing. Preparing for what? It was moving. It was reaching. And I was the only one who knew it was coming. The implications settled over me like a shroud, heavy and suffocating. The universe I thought I knew was a lie, a fragile illusion. And the truth was far, far more terrifying. There was this anomaly a warning, or was it a greeting? My fingers, stiff and raw from the cold, danced across the keyboard, each keystroke a small rebellion against the encroaching stillness. The data points swam before my eyes, a constellation of impossibilities that refused to resolve into anything sensible. I had to tell someone. The thought clawed at me, a desperate need to break this terrible solitude. The town's mayor, a man whose face was as weathered as the timber of his office, was my first target. His door, when I finally found it, was a heavy oak, etched with the carvings of local fauna. I knocked, the sound echoing in the frigid air, a lonely percussion. He opened it, his eyes, the color of faded denim, narrowed with a mixture of curiosity and impatience. "Thomas," I ran out and about then, thought the snow had I pinned. His voice was a low rumble like stones shifting. "Mayor," I began, my own voice cracking, unused to the open air. I've found something important, about the stars." He leaned against the door frame, a slow smile spreading across his face, revealing gaps where teeth had once been. "The stars, eh? Always been a bit of a dreamer, I am. What about them?" I took a deep breath, the icy air burning my lungs. It's not dreaming, it's data, anomalies, a pattern that suggests intelligence, something ancient, vast, and not friendly. The words felt flimsy, inadequate. The mayor's smile didn't waver, but a flicker of something else, something dismissive, crossed his eyes. Intelligence. Thomas, this town's seen its share of oddities. Folks here, they like their mysteries, but not friendly stars. That's a new one. He chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "No, Mayor, I don't understand. This isn't folklore. This is. It's a signal, a directed influence. It's changing things. We're in danger." My voice rose, a desperate plea. I gestured wildly, my gloved hands clumsy. "The data I can show I. It's not just about distant galaxies, it's about us. It's reaching out." He pushed himself off the doorframe, his expression now one of gentle pity. "Thomas, my boy, this winter's been hard on everyone. The isolation, it gets to I. I lost my wife, I remember, a terrible thing. Sometimes the mind, it plays tricks. It conjures things to fill the emptiness." He placed a hand on my shoulder, a rough, calloused weight. "Why don't I come inside? I've got some mulled wine. Warm I up." we can talk about. I think I'm imagining this, that I'm unwell. I think I read Grieving, Thomas, and that's a heavy burden. This town, we look out for each other, but we also know when to let things be, best to let them fade. He closed the door, the heavy oak thudding shut, a definitive punctuation mark. I stood there, the wind whipping snow around my legs, the mayor's words echoing in my mind. He didn't see it. He couldn't. The traditions, the preserved quiet, it was a shield. A fragile, beautiful shield against something that was about to shatter it. I tried the town's only general store, the proprietor, a stout woman with eyes that missed nothing. She listened, her hands busy arranging jars of preserves, her face impassive. When I finished, she merely shook her head. Thomas, I spend too much time with those machines. They don't have souls. They don't understand the world. The world is simple. It's about the harvest, the snow, the next generation. That's all there is. She offered me a jar of pickled beets. Take these. Good for the Constitution. Each rejection was a stone dropped into the pit of my growing despair. The isolation I'd felt in the observatory, a comfortable solitude born of focused research, was now a suffocating blanket of disbelief. They were so entrenched in their routines, their predictable lives, that they couldn't conceive of a threat that defied their understanding. They were like sheep, placidly grazing, unaware of the wolf that was not just at the door, but already inside the barn. The data pulsed on the server, a silent, insistent alarm. It wasn't just an observation anymore. It was a countdown, and I was the only one listening. The wind howled, a mournful dirge against the frosted panes of my small cabin. Snow piled higher, burying the tracks of the supply sled that had delivered my last provisions days ago. The mountain town, cut off by winter, traditions preserved, was now truly an island, isolated from the world by a shroud of white. My world, however, had shrunk even further, confined to the flickering screen of my terminal and the increasingly frantic calculations that swam before my eyes. They dismissed me. The academic council, the esteemed colleagues who'd once hailed my work on stellar evolution, now saw only a man unraveling. The data, though the data did not lie. It whispered of patterns too vast, too intricate to be natural. It spoke of a cosmic intelligence, ancient beyond reckoning, a consciousness that wove existence itself. And it was looking at us. I traced the anomaly again, a fractal bloom of corrupted information blooming across the deep space telemetry. It wasn't a glitch. It was a signature, a deliberate alteration, like a sculptor's chisel against raw marble. For weeks, I'd fed the raw feeds into my custom algorithms, stripping away the noise, the terrestrial interference, the predictable celestial mechanics. What remained was a symphony of impassable frequencies, a language I was only beginning to decipher. And the message, when it finally coalesced, was not one of observation, but of intent. My fingers flew across the keyboard, the rhythmic click-clack a counterpoint to the storm's fury. The air in the cabin grew heavy, thick with an unspoken tension that had been building for months. It was more than just the oppressive weight of the snow. It was a tangible pressure, a sense of being observed not just by the wind or the ancient pines outside, but by something infinitely older, infinitely more vast. I remembered the day my wife, Elena, had brought me a smooth, grey stone from the riverbed. She'd said it felt like it held the secrets of the earth. I'd laughed then, a man lost in the grandeur of galaxies. Now I understood. Everything held secrets. Everything hummed with a hidden life. The universe wasn't empty, it was teeming. And we, with our brief, flickering existences, were an insignificant blip in its ancient gaze. The data stream flickered. A new set of coordinates, impassably precise, resolved on the screen. They pointed not to a distant nebula or a nascent star, but to a point in our own solar system. A point just beyond the orbit of Jupiter. My breath hitched. This was it. The culmination of everything. Not just a theoretical possibility anymore, but a direct manifestation. The entity was not merely a distant observer. It was acting, and its focus had narrowed. A low hum began to emanate from my equipment. Not the familiar whir of cooling fans or the steady thrum of the power generator, but a deeper, resonant sound that vibrated through the floorboards, through my very bones. My hands trembled as I tried to input a command to isolate the source of the new frequency. The terminal screen swam, the lines of code blurring into an indecipherable script. The hum intensified, growing into a low thrumming that felt like the very air was being squeezed from my lungs. Outside, the wind died. An unnatural silence descended, broken only by the growing internal tremor of my own body. The snow, which had been falling in a furious blizzard, seemed to pause, suspended in the air for a heartbeat. Then began to fall again, not in individual flakes, but in a dense, suffocating curtain. I looked out the window. The familiar, snow-laden pines were gone, replaced by a swirling grey mist that obscured everything. The mountain town cut off by winter, traditions preserved, had vanished. The very landscape seemed to be dissolving, the solid reality of wood and stone and earth softening, blurring, becoming something else. The hum was now a palpable force, pressing against my eardrums, vibrating through my teeth. It was the sound of something immense, something awakening. It wasn't just a threat to Earth, it was a threat to everything, to the very concept of existence. My eyes darted to the small, tarnished silver locket on my desk, the one Alina had worn every day. It was a simple thing, a keepsake. I snatched it up, its cool metal a stark contrast to my clammy palm. I had to do something. I had to try. The screen flashed a single, repeating glyph. It was a symbol I'd seen before, buried deep within the corrupted data, a fragment of the alien language. It pulsed with a malevolent light, growing larger, filling the screen, filling my vision. It was a key, I realized with a terrifying certainty. A key to what? The cabin walls seemed to groan, not from the wind, but from an internal pressure, as if the very matter composing them was being stretched, warped. The hum reached a crescendo, deafening roar that was both sound and sensation. I squeezed my eyes shut, clutching the locket, the glyph burning behind my eyelids. When I opened them, the screen was blank. The hum had ceased. The silence was absolute, broken only by my ragged breaths. But the mist outside remained, thicker than before, and the pressure in the air was now a suffocating embrace. The world had changed, and I was the only one who knew why. What had I unleashed? The silence was the first thing. A thick, suffocating blanket that pressed in on my ears, a stark contrast to the shriek of the wind that had been my only companion. I opened my eyes. The cabin was the same. The worn leather armchair, the overflowing bookshelves, the faint scent of old paper and stale coffee. But the light was wrong. It wasn't the weak, diffused glow of a snowbound day. This light had a quality I couldn't place, a subtle luminescence that seemed to emanate from the very air, casting no shadows. I sat up, my limbs heavy, as if I'd slept for a week. My head throbbed with a dull ache, a phantom echo of the blinding flash that had consumed my vision. The flash. It had been so absolute, so complete, that I'd expected. I don't know what. Annihilation. Dissolution. Instead, there was just this. Stillness and the light. I stood, my knees protesting. The floorboards creaked, a familiar sound, yet it seemed amplified, distorted. I walked to the window. The snow was still there, a pristine white expanse stretching to the jagged peaks. But the sky. The sky was no longer the bruised, heavy gray of winter. It was a deep, impassable indigo studded not with stars, but with swirling nebulae of colors I had no names for. They pulsed, slow and rhythmic, like the breath of some colossal, sleeping beast. It was beautiful, terrifyingly, profoundly beautiful. My breath hitched. This was not the world I had left. The data streams, the cascading equations, the whispers from the void, they had culminated in this. A shift, a reordering. The entity, the architects of the unseen, had responded, or perhaps they had merely continued their work, and I, in my futile attempt to understand, had been caught in the periphery of their grand design. I ran a hand over my face. My skin felt different, taut almost. The familiar lines of worry and grief seemed smoothed away, replaced by an unnerving placidity. It was as if my very being had been recalibrated. It was the fear of the unknown, amplified to an unbearable degree. I looked at my hands. They were my hands, scarred from a childhood fall, calloused from years of fiddling with delicate instruments. I flexed my fingers. They responded, but the sensation was alien, as if I were controlling them from a distance. What had happened to the town, to the people? I remembered the elder, his weathered face etched with a wisdom that now seemed tragically inadequate. I remembered the innkeeper, her hearty laughter that had always been a balm, Were they still here, or had they too been altered? I needed to know. The cabin, once my sanctuary, now felt like a cage. I had to venture out. I had to see what remained of the world I knew. I pulled on my heavy coat, the familiar weight a small comfort. The air outside was cool, but it didn't bite with the sharp sting of winter. It was soft, like breathing in velvet. The snow crunched under my boots, a sound that seemed to reverberate through the unnaturally still air. The mountain town, cut off by winter, traditions preserved, was now something else entirely. The buildings stood, their wooden facades stoic against the impassable sky. Smoke curled from chimneys, a sign of life, but it was a pale, ethereal wisp, unlike the hardy plumes I was accustomed to. The usual chatter of the town square was absent. No dogs barked, no children's laughter, just the profound, unsettling quiet. I saw figures moving in the distance near the general store. They walked with a peculiar gait, a slow, deliberate grace. Their movements were too fluid, too precise. I shielded my eyes, squinting. Their clothes were the same, the practical woolens of mountain folk, but their faces. When one of them turned, I saw it. The eyes. They were not the eyes I remembered. They were vast, luminous, and utterly devoid of human emotion. They held the same swirling, impassable colors as the nebulae in the sky. This was not a dream. This was the consequence. The architects had not just reached out, they had touched, and the touch had reshaped everything. I stumbled backward, my foot catching on something unseen. I looked up at the figures. They were the townspeople, yet they were not. They were vessels, animated by something ancient and vast. The data had been a warning, a plea, perhaps, but I had been too late, or perhaps I had been precisely on time. The question that clawed at my throat, the one that threatened to shatter the fragile calm that had settled over me, was this. Was I one of them now? There was this placid emptiness the new state of being, and if so, what was the point of anything at all? I opened my eyes. But the air itself felt different, thinner, charged. The snow had stopped. Not a gentle cessation, but a violent halt, as if the sky had simply decided to cease its weeping. The world outside was a canvas of impassable white, the peaks of the surrounding mountains etched against a bruised, twilight sky. The mountain town, cut off by winter, traditions preserved, was utterly still. No smoke curled from chimneys, no faint sounds of life escaped the thick timber walls. It was as if the entire valley had been frozen in a single, breath-held moment. A tremor, not of cold, but of an alien dread, traced its way down my spine. The data, the calculations, they hadn't been wrong, they had been incomplete. A vast, indifferent intellect, yes, but not merely observing, influencing, shaping. And now it had noticed. It had turned its impassable gaze towards the speck of dust I called home. I pushed myself up from the armchair, my joints protesting with a dry, cracking sound. The floorboards beneath my bare feet were ice-cold, a sensation that usually sent a jolt of discomfort through me, but now felt distant, as if my body were merely a vessel, the true me already adrift in the cosmic currents I had so foolishly sought to understand. My eyes fell upon the small wooden table where I had laid out my final computations. The papers were still there, but the ink seemed to have faded, the lines blurring as if succumbing to some unseen erosion. I reached out to touch them, my fingertips brushing against the rough texture of the paper. It felt brittle, ancient, like fragments of a forgotten civilization. The wind, which had been absent moments before, began to stir again. But this was no natural gale. It carried with it a symphony of impassable sounds, the grinding of tectonic plates, the silent scream of dying stars, the rhythmic pulse of something impassably vast and ancient. It was the language of the entity, a language that bypassed my ears and spoke directly to the primal core of my being. I stumbled back, my hands flying to my temples. It spoke of cycles, of cosmic ages, of worlds born and extinguished like sparks from a celestial forge. It spoke of my wife, not with sorrow or remembrance, but as a fleeting configuration of matter, a transient pattern in the grand design. The grief I had carried for so long, the anchor that had tethered me to humanity, began to fray, its threads dissolving in the face of this overwhelming, impersonal truth. My gaze snapped to the window again. The sky. It was no longer bruised. It was rippling, like water disturbed by an unseen force. The stars, which should have been sharp pinpricks of light, were smeared, elongated, their spectral hues bleeding into one another. It was as if reality itself was being stretched, pulled taut by an unseen hand. A profound sense of insignificance washed over me, not one of despair, but of a terrible, liberating clarity. My quest, my grief, my very existence, they were less than a mote of dust in the grand cosmic tapestry. The entity, in its unfathomable wisdom, was not destroying us. It was reordering us, reintegrating us into its own, infinitely complex design. I felt a strange pull, a yearning to understand, to participate in this cosmic recalibration. The entity was not a destroyer, it was a sculptor, and Earth was merely a new canvas. My eyes widened as I saw it. High above the snow-laden peaks, where the sky should have been a uniform, ethereal gray, a new constellation was forming. Not of stars, but of shifting geometric patterns, impossibly intricate and vibrant. They pulsed with an inner light, a light that seemed to originate from beyond the visible spectrum, a light that spoke of creation and dissolution in the same breath. It was not a threat, but an invitation, an offer to shed the limitations of my flesh, to become one with the grand cosmic intelligence, to cease being Thomas, the grieving husband, the disillusioned astrophysicist, and to become something else, something immeasurably older, vaster, and more terrifyingly beautiful. My body felt heavy, anchored to the floor, yet my consciousness was already soaring, drawn towards the impossible patterns in the sky. The scent of old paper and coffee vanished, replaced by the crisp, clean smell of starlight and the faint, metallic tang of ozone. I looked down at my hands. They were beginning to shimmer, their outlines blurring, becoming indistinct. Was this the end or the beginning? Was I being consumed or transformed? The mountain town, the traditions, the very concept of human, they were fading, dissolving into a new, incomprehensible order. And I, Thomas, was no longer just watching. I was becoming part of the show. But to what end?